I want to start today with a premise from our stack that feels almost um, dangerous to say out loud.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's one of those ideas that once you hear it, it makes you look at every painting, every movie, and honestly, every mirror completely differently.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
The premise is this: innocence and nudity have absolutely nothing to do with each other.
Wow.
Right. Biologically speaking, they aren't even on the same map.
That does feel incredibly counterintuitive, doesn't it? Because in our current cultural framework, those two concepts are just glued together.
Exactly. Glued to.
You remove the clothes, you remove the innocence. But when we actually wade through the anthropology, the evolutionary biology, and the philosophy we have on the table today, that glue kind of just dissolves.
And that is exactly what we are doing today in this deep dive. We're taking a solvent to that glue.
I like that.
We are looking at a lineup of absolute heavy hitters. We've got Margaret Mead, Michel Foucault, evolutionary biologist Daniel Lieberman, and some really compelling psychology on agency from DC and Ryan.
It's a massive stack.
It really is. And the mission today is to figure out why we have this collective hallucination that the natural body is inherently shameful, or that it's, somehow corrupt just by existing.
Hallucination is a strong word, but honestly, it fits perfectly here.
You think so?
Definitely. The central thesis emerging from all these sources is that the body is neutral.
Yeah.
It's biologically agnostic.
Okay, biologically agnostic. I love that phrasing.
Right, so a moral judgment we project onto skin is software, not hardware. And it's software that was installed relatively recently in our evolutionary history.
So let's talk about that hardware first, because I was reading the notes on Daniel Lieberman's book, The Story of the Human Body, and it really forces you to zoom out.
Way out.
Yeah, way out. We usually think of history as, pyramids and Rome and ancient empires, but biologically, Homo sapiens have been running this show for roughly 300,000 years.
Give or take, yeah. And for the vast majority of that timeline, we were operating in a completely different context regarding coverage.
Right, because clothing, actual functional clothing, is a pretty huge newcomer to the scene. The estimates and the research suggest maybe 100,000 years.
And even that 100,000 mark is likely a generous upper bound, primarily for populations moving into colder latitudes where it was just necessary.
Right, to literally not freeze to death.
Exactly. For meaningful, complex clothing that obscures the body entirely, it's likely much, much more recent.
Okay, so just do the math with me here. For at least 200,000 years, human beings, people with brains just like ours, emotions just like ours, they were navigating their social worlds, raising children, and building communities without this layer of fabric.
At a huge span of time.
If nudity was inherently shameful, if it was this biological trigger for moral corruption, our ancestors would have been in a state of constant crippling anxiety for 2/3 of our existence.
Which is an evolutionary dead end.
Mm-hmm.
You simply cannot have a species that is fundamentally ashamed of its own baseline state.
It wouldn't survive.
Not at all. Evolution selects for traits that aid survival and reproduction. Crippling shame about one's own anatomy serves neither of those. It wastes energy, and it creates massive social friction.
So the shame setting just isn't factory default.
No. And the great thing is we don't just have to guess about the Pleistocene era to prove this. We can look at developmental psychology right now.
Oh, right, the infant argument.
Yes. Michael Lewis breaks this down beautifully in his work, Shame, the Exposed Self. He argues that shame is not a primary emotion.
Primary meaning what, exactly?
Primary emotions are things like fear or joy, which are instant and innate.
Like fear is there's a tiger, run. Joy is here's a berry, eat.
Exactly. Shame is what psychologists call a self-conscious evaluation. It requires cognitive machinery that infants simply don't have yet.
So they literally can't feel it.
Right. If you observe a toddler, say 2 years old, running around without clothes, they're completely unbothered. They aren't suppressing shame. The concept simply doesn't exist for them.
I have absolutely seen this. You basically have to teach them to cover up. Usually by the parents reacting with shock or running after them, telling them, no, put this on.
And that is the installation process of the software. Lewis points out that for shame to exist, a child first needs to develop a sense of self, the ability to recognize themselves in a mirror, which happens around 18 months.
But even then, that's just the hardware kicking in.
Precisely. The software is the social standard. The child has to learn, I am being watched, and the person watching me expects me to be covered.
Wow. So the shame doesn't come from their body at all. It comes from the disconnect between their body and the expectation of the parent.
It's entirely relational. If you don't teach the standard, the shame doesn't spontaneously generate out of nowhere.
And just to hammer this home, the nature check in our sources points out that we are the only species that does this.
The only one. In the animal kingdom, visual signaling is entirely functional. It's about attracting a mate, asserting dominance, or signaling health. It is never about modesty.
A peacock isn't worried that his display is, like, too much.
No. And a chimp isn't embarrassed by its grooming habits. There is absolutely no moral dimension to anatomy in the rest of the biosphere.
Okay, so if nature didn't invent this and biology didn't invent this, we did. It is a human invention.
It is a cultural technology.
Which pivots us perfectly to the anthropology stack. Because if this is a technology, different cultures must use different operating systems.
Right.
And this is where Margaret Mead comes in. Now, I know her 1928 work, Coming of Age in Samoa, has been debated and picked apart by modern academics for a century, but the core observation she made still feels incredibly radical today.
It really does. And we should definitely acknowledge that anthropology has evolved a lot since Mead, but her central inquiry was valid. She was asking, is the stress of adolescence universal?
Because in the 1920s, the West just assumed that the teenage years were biologically destined to be this time of intense sexual repression, shame, and angst.
The whole rebel without a cause narrative, we thought that was just what automatically happens when hormones hit.
But Mead went out to Samoa and found something very different, didn't she?
She documented a society where the body simply wasn't a source of secrecy. Adolescent sexuality and the physical form were treated with a degree of casualness and openness that was completely alien to the American puritanical mindset.
So she essentially found that the universal crisis of bodily shame was actually just a localized American crisis.
It was a local problem, yeah.
Yeah.
She proved that you can have a functioning, orderly society where the human body is not a site of constant moral panic.
Which is huge.
And Ruth Benedict, who was writing Patterns of Culture around the exact same time, formalized this into the idea of cultural relativity.
Benedict is the one who talks about the arc of culture, right?
Yes. She argued that every culture selects a few traits from the great arc of human possibilities and builds its entire reality around them.
So one culture might prioritize aggression, another might prioritize cooperation.
Exactly. One might obsess over covering the body, another might not even notice it. Morality is culture-shaped. One society's taboo is another's everyday norm.
It reminds me of that saying, we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are.
That's a great way to put it.
Benedict is basically saying that when a Western explorer lands on an island and sees people in loincloths and thinks, oh, how primitive and immoral, that reaction says literally nothing about the islanders.
And it says everything about the explorer.
Right.
This is where the ecological argument is really important to layer in, too.
Right.
We so often mistake survival for morality.
How so?
Think about the indigenous populations in equatorial regions, historically, the Amazon, parts of Africa, the Pacific Islands. For thousands of years, wearing minimal clothing wasn't a philosophical statement about freedom or a lack of morals.
It was just hot.
It was incredibly hot and humid. Clothes trap heat, they trap moisture, they cause fungal infections, they rot in the damp. Nudity, or near nudity, was simply the most sophisticated technological adaptation to that specific environment.
But then you get people coming from cold, rainy Europe, where layers are physically necessary for survival, and they project their need for layers onto the indigenous nakedness.
They view the adaptation as a lack. They see a lack of clothes and assume a lack of discipline or a lack of godliness. But in reality, wearing a wool coat in the jungle is just a lack of common sense.
Okay, so we've established that the body is neutral, shame is learned, and our hang-ups are largely geographic and cultural accidents.
Correct.
But this leaves a massive question on the table. If the body is neutral, why do we care so much? Why have we built entire civilizations around hiding it? It can't just be a random accident that's stuck.
Now we are wading into the deep end. This is where we have to talk about power. And you really cannot talk about the history of the body and power without talking about Michel Foucault.
I always feel like Foucault is the guy at the party who ruins the vibe but is absolutely right about everything.
He definitely complicates things. In his work, The History of Sexuality, Foucault challenges the idea that we just organically became repressed and now we just need to liberate ourselves.
Okay, so what's his take?
He argues that the way we talk about the body, the rules, the taboos, the medicalization of it, is actually a very deliberate system of control.
This is the biopower concept.
Biopower, yes. It's the idea that modern states don't just control territory, they control bodies. Think about it. If you can convince a population that their natural state is shameful or unruly, you create a people who are constantly monitoring themselves.
That is the panopticon concept, isn't it? The idea that you don't need a guard in the prison tower if the prisoner believes they might be watched at any given moment.
Precisely. If I believe my body is a source of potential corruption, I become my own policeman. I monitor my hemline, I monitor my desires, I monitor how I sit and how I stand.
So you internalize the control so the state or the culture doesn't even have to enforce it.
It is terrifyingly efficient. Foucault suggests that narratives about purity often serve the existing hierarchy. By defining the body as something that inherently needs to be contained, you justify the structures that do the containing.
Whether that's the church, the school, or the medical establishment.
Exactly. It turns the body into an object, something to be managed and disciplined.
And that objectification is the root of the shame, which connects to the phenomenology we have in the notes from Merleau-Ponty.
Yes.
He makes this brilliant distinction between having a body and being a body. Break that down for me.
Being a body is your lived experience. It's you, right now, feeling the chair you're sitting in, breathing, listening to my voice. It is the subject.
Okay.
Having a body is when you look at yourself in the mirror and judge the reflection. You detach. You look at your physical form as a thing, an object.
And shame can only happen to the object.
Yes.
Yeah.
You cannot feel shame when you are fully in your lived experience. You feel shame when you step outside of yourself and look at yourself through the eyes of the other, the judge.
The notes actually list the conditions for shame here, which I think really clarifies this. It says there are 3 ingredients required for shame to bake.
Right. Since nature doesn't provide the recipe, culture has to supply these 3 things. Ingredient 1 is social comparison. You have to be able to compare your object to someone else's object.
The body is proper, but mine is improper.
Exactly. Ingredient 2 is norm enforcement. There has to be a societal rule that explicitly says variation A is good, but variation B is bad.
And the third?
Ingredient 3 is cultural codes. We have to collectively agree that this specific body part is private and that one over there is public.
And those codes are completely arbitrary. I mean, you look at history. Ankles were scandalous, and then they weren't. Shoulders were perfectly fine, and then suddenly they weren't.
The codes change constantly, but the mechanism of shame remains exactly the same. It's a tool to keep the object in line with the group.
So if we strip all that away, the comparison, the arbitrary rules, the self-policing, we are left with what? Because we still have this concept of innocence. And I think for most listeners, innocence is still heavily tied to that untouched idea.
That is the pivot point of today's deep dive. The source material challenges us to redefine innocence entirely. It actually offers 3 distinct ways to look at it.
Okay, let's run through them.
The first is what we've been discussing, sexual untouchedness. This is what we call the fragile vase theory. You are innocent until you are seen or touched, or until you know too much.
Which is a terrible model, honestly, because it means growing up is essentially a tragedy. You are just destined to break.
Right. It frames maturity and experience as a loss.
Yeah.
The second definition is moral purity, which is simply following the rules of your specific, localized culture perfectly.
Okay, and the third?
The third definition, and this comes from the psychology of self-determination theory, specifically the work of Deci and Ryan, is psychological coherence or integrity.
This feels like the antidote to Foucault's biopower.
It creates a path forward, yes. Self-determination theory argues that human well-being relies heavily on agency. Do you have autonomy? Is your behavior originating from your own self, or is it being coerced?
So applying this to the body, innocence isn't about whether you are naked or clothed. It's about whether you are choosing to be naked or clothed.
Yes. The source argues that the real loss of innocence isn't visibility. It isn't anatomy. The real loss of innocence is coercion. It's the removal of agency.
That is a massive distinction because the traditional story, the Adam and Eve style story, is that the moment they realized they were naked, they were fallen. The seeing was the sin.
But look at it through the lens of agency. If a person chooses to be visible, say, in a piece of art, or in a naturalist setting, or just alone in their own home, and that choice is autonomous and integrated with their sense of self, there is no psychological fracture. There is no shame.
Because they haven't been objectified by an outside force, they are the subject of their own action.
Correct. But if someone is forced to be naked, or conversely, forced to be covered against their will, that is where the psychological damage happens. That is where the integrity is breached.
It shifts the moral weight completely. It stops asking how much skin is showing and starts asking who is in control of this situation.
It moves ethics from the visual to the relational. The danger isn't the physical body. The danger is the power dynamic.
This actually makes innocence much more robust. It's not a vase that breaks the first time someone looks at you. It's a state of being in command of your own boundaries.
And that connects right back to the infant we talked about earlier. The infant is innocent, not because they don't know anything, but because they are wholly integrated. They are just being.
Right.
As adults, regaining that sense of innocence isn't about forgetting what sex is or pretending we don't have bodies. It's about regaining that integration, being the subject again, not the object.
That is heavy, but also really liberating. It suggests that we can actually opt out of the shame game.
We can certainly start to deprogram the software.
So let's try to tie this all together, because we have traveled from the Pleistocene era to modern psychology today. We started with the biological reality that for 300,000 years, nudity was just life. It was the baseline.
And we established that shame is a learned behavior, not an instinct. We have to be taught to view our bodies as objects of judgment.
We looked at the anthropology, with Mead and Benedict showing us that these rules are totally relative. They aren't laws of physics. They're just local customs.
And we saw how those customs can become tools of power and control, as Foucault warned us.
But the landing gear for all of this is this new definition of innocence, one that is based entirely on agency.
That is the structural conclusion of the stack. Visibility does not equal corruption. The body is neutral. The morality comes from how we treat that body, our own and others.
It really forces you to check your own reactions. When you see a violation of these norms out in the world, someone breastfeeding in public or someone wearing something culturally risque, that little flare of judgment you feel, that's not God talking. That's not biology talking.
That is just the software running its script.
And that leads us to the final thought we wanted to leave you with today. If we accept the stack, if we accept that the body is neutral and shame is completely learned, it poses a really difficult question for you as a listener.
It does. We all like to think our moral compass is ours, that it comes from deep within our own soul. But if so much of this is culturally programmed,
How much of your own moral instinct, that gut feeling of what is proper or shameful, is actually just a code someone else wrote for you?
and if you looked at the code, would you keep it or would you rewrite it?
That is the question. Are you running the program, or is the program running you? Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.